through some qualitative research which looked at how people differ in some of their attitudes towards the bushfire threat. And we get some interesting patterns emerging if we look at three sort of broad areas of people's, three broad attitudes. One is how people perceive their vulnerability to the threat of bushfire. The second one is, what's the sort of inconvenience factor of responding to this bushfire threat? And what is their attitude towards the threat? How much of the threat are they prepared to tolerate? And so in talking to people and exploring those three attitudes, some interesting patterns emerge. There's some people who see themselves as very vulnerable for all sorts of reasons. It might be their situation, it might be their personal capacity or their family situation, but for one reason or another, they see themselves as vulnerable to the risk. They also don't see many barriers to leaving. They don't want to be there during the threat. Their priority is to actually avoid the threat. And so concerns about leaving don't really trouble them. They're not troubled by the inconvenience of leaving. And they differ in some respects from another group of people who also see themselves as vulnerable to the threat, but they also think that the inconvenience factor of leaving is high. And these people are concerned about the threat, but it needs to be a bit more tangible before they'll actually feel threatened. They need to see some signs of it before they actually regard it as a threat. Another pattern that emerged was those people who actually don't see themselves as particularly vulnerable. It may be that their assessment of the risk is that it's lower where they live, or they might feel that they've got quite good capacity to deal with the risk. These people tended to see the inconvenience of leaving and dealing with the risk as being quite high. So they didn't want to leave for all sorts of reasons. They might lose their house, looters might come in, you might not be able to get back into your house and so on. So they saw that the inconvenience of leaving was high. And these people were more inclined to tolerate a reasonable level of threat. So they're quite threat tolerant. And they had some intention to try and protect their property if they could. And then the fourth group were those who didn't see themselves as very vulnerable to the threat. They saw that there was a lot of inconvenience in leaving, but they had actually made a conscious decision to stay, so they had a priority to protect their property. And these sort of four patterns represent, I think, four distinct sort of orientations to the risk or perspectives on the bushfire risk that are helpful in understanding people's response to the policies that we put in place. Because when you line that up against a timeline of a fire, from the increased fire danger, say on a code red day, for example, when there's high risk of bushfire, through to ignition, to the approach of a fire to a particular community, to the imminent threat that's posed by the fire, to its impact, you can see that those attitudes line up with particular intentions of what people intend to do. So the first group are quite predisposed to leave early. They don't see many inconveniences and feel highly vulnerable, so leaving is not a problem for them. They'll even leave before there's a fire because they're that concerned about the risk. The second group need to see some evidence of the threat before it will overcome the inconvenience of leaving. So that threat balancing type thing has to come into play. The third group, they're going to wait and see because they're not particularly concerned about the threat. They feel that they've got the capacity to deal with it. They've got a priority to protect, so they will stay on, but they're not going to stay to the bitter end and risk dying. At least that's the plan. And the fourth group are those who've made a conscious decision to stay and defend because their priority is to protect. And in many cases, they feel quite confident about doing that, and many of them have actually done a great deal of work to try and achieve that. Now, as I said before, the Bushfires Royal Commission, when it looked at how people responded on Black Saturday and what the policy approach was, said that the approach then was ignoring people in those middle categories. the approach was trying to get people to either leave early or stay and defend, and there was insufficient attention to the risks associated with the middle two groups. But if you look at them, there's actually some risks associated with all of those groups, because the problem for the first group is that they're willing to leave, but how many times are they willing to leave on high-risk days? And so the risk is of getting fatigued with packing up and leaving, and then nothing particularly serious happens. Do they really want to keep doing that all the time? The second group, the problem for them is that, yes, they intend to leave if they know there's a fire, but if there's a delay in getting that notice, or they delay their decision to actually pack up and leave for whatever reason, they run the risk of being trapped and then they're unprepared to stay. The third group run the risk of being overconfident about their capacity to deal with it, and then find themselves confronting a fire that they didn't really want to confront, but unable to leave. And the final group, although they intended to stay, run the risk of lacking the capacity to actually deal with the fire that they face, and consequently being overwhelmed. And I think it would be true to say that there were people in all of those three categories who delayed and were trapped, people who were overconfident and got trapped, and people who were overwhelmed on Black Saturday were a significant part of the people who died. So if we think about those in terms of people's response to the bushfire problem, we need to think about different interventions to try and progress or make them safer and more resilient. And so they've actually got different needs in terms of how we try and address that problem. The first group need encouragement to do what they've already decided to do, and to assist them to leave early, make that as easy as possible so that they'll keep doing that desirable behaviour. The second group are going to be quite dependent on warnings. We need to make leaving early for them and efficient, particularly if it's going to be through evacuation. They're the people who will be most likely to respond to an evacuation in an emergency event. The third group need to be made more aware of the consequences of their action, because they're actually choosing a behaviour which puts them at increased risk. So they're going to need particularly clear, unambiguous warnings of the seriousness of the threat they're facing, but they're also more likely to be the people who have to resort to local shelters if their house is unable to protect them. And the final group who've chosen to stay and defend, they're people who really need some sort of audit of their preparation and their capacity to do it, to check whether they have the resources and the skills to actually carry that out and understand what they're actually taking on. So what I'm trying to do here is paint a picture of community response is not something we can just think of one big community out there and how they respond to bushfire. That it's shaped very much by people's attitudes to the risk and how they're going to deal with the interventions which are put in place as a result of the policy. And what I want to stress here is that people are active participants in this process. They're not passively sitting there waiting for governments and agencies just to give them information to tell them what to do. They're actually processing information before the fire, during the fire, all the time. They're processing information and they're judging the risk. They're making judgments about how at risk